Today, Thursday, 19th October, the world continues to be racked by the two double crises, the crisis in Ukraine and the crisis in the Middle East. And it is with the crisis in the Middle East that I will begin, because this is the crisis which is now currently attracting the most attention. Briefly, despite claims that were circulating yesterday that following President Biden's trip to Israel, the Israelis would begin their ground offensive in Gaza. As of the time of making of this program, that ground offensive has still not begun. There continue to be numerous comments by Israeli spokesmen suggesting that a ground offensive is imminent, and I'm afraid that it is likely that one will indeed take place, despite the fact that there is now a significant chorus of advice, even from military people and people who understand such matters better than I do, and even from people who are generally strongly sympathetic to Israel, that a ground offensive in Gaza is extremely problematic and might not be successful, or might not be successful in any reasonable length of time. I've seen some reports which suggest that a ground offensive could take months, and of course it might be longer than that. And if we go back to the fighting that took place in Mosul, in Iraq, when the Iraqi forces, backed by the weight of the US Air Force, finally closed on what was the biggest city controlled by ISIS. Well, as I remember, the siege of Mosul took the better part of a year, and the siege of Raqqa, a much smaller place, took even longer. So these can be protracted and very difficult battles, especially if the fighters are dug in and well entrenched and have bunkers, tunnels, and abundant supplies. Now, in saying all of this, I want to again qualify by making the further and obvious point that this makes certain assumptions about Hamas, about the quality, or shall I say, maybe not the quality, but the training levels, the motivation, the organization of the Hamas fighters that are said to, that will be fighting in Gaza against the Israelis. Now, it could be that this is overestimated. It could be that Hamas will collapse under the weight of the Israeli attack. But I have to say, most people who've been observing this conflict up to this point doubt that, and of course, with no sign of any general evacuation of the entire civilian population from Gaza. An Israeli offensive into Gaza is going to provoke heavy casualties amongst the civilian population, probably, if the fighting is intense, heavy casualties amongst the Israeli soldiers, and of course Hamas fighters who are not obviously mostly in uniform will be able to melt within the civilian population and will be in a position to do all the things that insurgents do, about which I'm not an expert, but about which there is a huge, enormous literature. A former British soldier who is a regular member of the Duran community and who discusses many things with me, has told me that in his experience, urban combat is just about the most nightmarish type of combat an infantryman can find himself drawn into. And moreover, he says that even in training, it is considered to be exceptionally tough. Well, that nonetheless seems to be what the Israelis intend to do. Now, President Biden went to Israel. He was supposed to go to Israel counselling restraint. There's been various statements that he has been counselling the Israelis restraint. There's reports that he's told the Israelis not to repeat the mistakes the United States made after 9/11, not to make decisions in anger, that kind of thing. All I can say is that, as is always and invariably the case with President Biden, one gets the sense that what he is going to say and what is actually going to happen are two entirely separate and different things. I don't get the impression at all that in private he counselled the Israelis in any meaningful way to exercise restraint. And I don't think that the Israelis feel under particular pressure from him to do so. The Israelis, or at least the Israeli authorities, have made clear that they have a clear objective in mind, which is the destruction of Hamas. They've apparently decided to go into Gaza and do it after presumably a heavy bombing campaign, which, by the way, still continues. And I don't think they've heard anything from President Biden that might persuade them to change their mind, or which might pressure them to do so. So anyone who might have hoped that President Biden would do that, I think that they're going to be disappointed. And in the meantime, it's absolutely clear to me that in every other conceivable respect, his trip to the Middle East turned out to be a complete debacle. He's apparently, or so he claims, persuaded the Egyptians to open one of the crossing points into Gaza to allow humanitarian relief supplies into Gaza. I find that a very strange claim indeed, since I had read previously in the Financial Times and in the Guardian and in the Telegraph and in various parts of the US media that in fact it was the Israelis who were refusing to allow relief supplies into Gaza because they wanted the crossing points opened so that the population from Gaza could leave Gaza and enter Sinai. And that the Egyptians were rejecting that, and that this was what had created the impasse. So unless those earlier media reports were wrong, which I don't believe, then it seems to me far more plausible that it was President Biden persuaded, it was the Israelis that he persuaded to open these crossing points so as to allow relief supplies to go into Gaza. Again, we see this discrepancy between words and apparent actions. And I would add that the fact that the relief supplies have been allowed to enter into Gaza is a sign of the mounting diplomatic and political pressure on the United States that we're now starting to see. And in all other respects, it seems to me that President Biden's trip to the Middle East has been a complete debacle. He wasn't, as I said, merely going to meet the Israelis. Meeting the Israelis, making all the statements that President Biden has been making, is, as I said in my video yesterday, a case of the Americans, of the Western powers, talking to themselves. What President Biden needed to do, what he should have done, is, of course, gone on to meet the Arab leaders, speak to the Arab leaders, the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, the President of the Palestinian Authority. He was due to meet with them all in Amman, in Jordan, and logically and properly, he should have flown from Jordan after he'd met one group of Arab leaders there. He should have flown on, like his Secretary of State did, Tony Blinken did. He should have flown on to Riyadh and met the Saudis there as well. But of course, he did none of these things, because following the events, and I'm using the word very carefully now, in the hospital in Gaza, which have caused uproar and huge anger across the Arab and Muslim world. More about that in a moment. The Jordanians, obviously deeply unimpressed with what they have seen so far from the Americans, aware that they were not going to get from President Biden any meaningful proposals. Instead, they would probably only get pressure to open their borders, to allow people from Gaza to leave and to flood into Sinai and perhaps into Jordan. Anyway, the Jordanians called the entire summit meeting off, so that the president decided apparently that there was no point in him flying on to Jordan at all and meeting the king there. It's unclear whether the king would have received him, and accordingly he flew back to the United States. Now, I have to say that this has not attracted in the West the attention, the media attention that it deserves. In my experience, this is wholly unprecedented. I cannot recall a single case where a summit meeting with the President of the United States has been called off in this manner. And of course, it is completely different from everything that we have seen in the past relating to the conduct of American diplomacy in the Middle East. Usually, when there is a crisis in the Middle East, when there is an event like the event that happened or allegedly happened at the hospital in Gaza, the Arab leaders feel that it is even more important that they should speak to the President of the United States, because they rely on him to provide some restraint, to provide some restraint upon the Israelis. The fact that the Arab leaders on this occasion chose to reject a meeting with the President of the United States is a massive snub to the President, to Biden himself, and, by the way, to the US government at this particular point in time. But it is also a clear sign that the Arab leaders on this occasion have no expectations that any meeting with the President will serve any purpose, and do not want to be put in a position where they are pressured to do that which they do not want to do, which is to open their borders. The fact that the Arab leaders have taken this stance, the fact that there is apparently, that there hasn't been any follow-up trip to Saudi Arabia to meet King Salman and his son, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is, of course, also Saudi Arabia's Prime Minister. The fact that the Arab leaders have basically slammed the door in Biden's face is a debacle. It represents the collapse of US prestige and authority and influence in the Arab world, and that is how it should be reported. And this has happened for two essential reasons. Firstly, the Arabs have lost patience with US diplomacy. They do not believe that this administration is capable or competent of conducting US diplomacy effectively. And it also means that the Arab states have reached conclusions that US power in the Middle East is on the decline, that there are other rising powers, the Chinese and the Russians, who are better positioned to help the Arabs or to support the Arabs in this kind of crisis. And so meeting with the president, the US president, is no longer wise or even necessary. And those who have any doubts that we are looking at a total debacle, let me repeat again the disastrous failure of the trip previously by Secretary of State Blinken to the Middle East. He went to Egypt, where he was lectured and pretty much insulted by the Egyptian President al-Sisi. He went to Saudi Arabia, where he was kept waiting for an entire night before he finally had a meeting with MBS, a meeting which by all accounts did not go particularly well. He also met Saudi Arabia's foreign minister. I discussed the statements that the Saudi Arabian foreign minister made in my program yesterday, and how they didn't give an inch in any respect, and how I also pointed out that in conversations with the Chinese foreign minister, the Saudi foreign minister opened up even further and said to the Chinese foreign minister what he undoubtedly also said to Blinken in private, which is that displacement of the population of Gaza is unacceptable and continues for the Arab states to be a red line, and that this is now a joint Arab position. And perhaps as a way of turning the knife even further, demonstrating even more clearly the fact that the Saudis have completely turned their backs on the United States in this crisis. We have had confirmation that yesterday who should be received in Saudi Arabia but the foreign minister of Iran, the US's great nemesis in the Middle East, and the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers had what by all accounts was a cordial meeting in which they agreed on the way forward. So, a debacle, a complete failure diplomatically, in diplomatic terms, of this visit. President Biden has already, by the way, pulled back on reports that were circulating that he'd ruled out the use of American troops, even if Hezbollah were to enter the fight on Hamas's side. He's now pulled that back, and it seems that having the American troops, the aircraft carrier battle groups, fight against Hamas is now once more on the agenda and a possibility. We'll come to what President Putin has hinted about that in a moment. But anyway, we've had what we're now going to have, apparently, is an address to the American people by President Biden, perhaps today. It's expected that he's going to announce a $100 billion aid package to be divided between Ukraine and Israel. Ukraine is apparently going to get 60% of the funds. Israel is going to get 40%. So that's a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine. Note that he is again prioritizing Ukraine over Israel. And I wonder what people in Congress will think about that. But that's another issue, one to be discussed later. But I expect that he's going to make a statement which will, in effect, green light the Israeli operation in Gaza. And then, of course, we will see what happens, whether the war will expand and include Hezbollah and other Arab countries. Already there are reports, by the way, that militia groups in Iraq are threatening to attack US bases in Iraq. And of course, there's also the question of what might happen to the US troops in Syria. The US's Kurdish allies are also Muslim. They've also expressed solidarity with the Palestinians. It could be that the friendship between the Kurds and the Americans in eastern Syria might also now start to fray. But already the situation of those American troops in Syria is becoming more complex. I can very easily see how this whole situation could spiral out of control. And of course, and again, I'm not a military person, I don't know the military realities, I'm not a student of the military realities closely, but if Israel does get bogged down in a long, grinding battle in Gaza against Hamas fighters, if it fails to make dramatic progress, and I don't know that that is the case, and I'm not going to make any definite forecasts about it, but it does seem to me a strong possibility, then of course the United States will be left with another war on its hands, one more pressing in terms of priority for the United States than the war in Ukraine, and at a time when there are growing concerns about the state of the US economy and about the state of the global economy altogether. I wonder to what extent the continued support for Israel as well as for Ukraine in this conflict is sustainable, despite what I thought were the fatuous comments by US Secretary of State Janet Yellen that the United States can supposedly afford both wars at the same time. This at a time when the United States is running a deficit which is estimated to come to above 8% of GDP this year, when bond yields are spiking, when there are widespread concerns about the price of oil, when there's indications that inflation might before long start to tick up again. I wonder really how sustainable this is. President Biden may not perhaps understand this, and perhaps his advisors don't either. But if his ability to survive a outright debacle in the conflict in Ukraine is problematic, then, in my opinion, his chances of surviving a debacle in the Middle East are somewhere close to nil. I cannot imagine that he will stand much prospect of re-election if there is a bitter fight in the Middle East, more problems in the global economy, and if the conflict ends with some kind of messy ceasefire in which none of the objectives that the United States and Israel have set themselves have been achieved. So that's what I wanted to say about President Biden. I do want to talk, first of all, briefly about the events in Gaza at the hospital, and I really want to reiterate that I'm only going to talk about these very briefly. I have had a deluge of comments about this, about what happened at the hospital, and basically they divide into two camps. One explains to me why it was almost certainly Israel that was responsible for this attack. There's been explanations that the bomb or missile that might have been used was some kind of fuel air explosive bomb which would not leave a crater but which would cause enormous damage. The Russians have used these type of weapons considerably in the fighting in Ukraine, though not to my knowledge in any built-up areas. Israel apparently has a significant stockpile of these kind of weapons, and apparently a bomb of that nature would cause the kind of devastation that has been reported and would probably not leave a crater. and that supposedly is reconcilable with the information from the area, from the photographs and things of that kind. Of course, that's one view. A different view is that almost certainly it was a Hamas rocket or an Islamic Jihad rocket that went off course. There's some film evidence apparently of a rocket breaking up and falling to earth. The pictures of the car park where this rocket is supposed to have fallen do not suggest widespread devastation. And there's, from some of these people, much skepticism that the casualties in the hospital were anywhere near as great as has been alleged. And it's been suggested that, in fact, we've not really seen proper evidence that there were those casualties. I'm going to say straight away, first of all, and I'm going to say thanks to everybody who sent me these messages. I would reply on one particular point. It is useless sending me photographic evidence. I can't see it very well, and I'm not in a position to assess what it means. I don't have that degree of technical knowledge. And what I will also say is that in this kind of situation, it's important to exercise massive skepticism about what each side says and about what evidence each side provides. And there is no substitute for an independent investigation of these kind of incidents, and none appears to be underway, which I find extraordinary, by the way. I would have thought that the first thing to happen in this kind of situation is for the Security Council in the United Nations to meet, to call for an independent investigation, to authorize people to go and to carry out an inspection of the scene and to take samples and to interview witnesses and to discuss what happened with the respective militaries and to look at the logbooks that militaries, to my knowledge, do keep. And then in a couple of weeks' time, and it would take a certain amount of time, but perhaps not very long, provide a report explaining what happened. I would have thought that was essential. And I find it incredible again that nothing like that is actually happening. But there we are. It's no surprise to me that we have these two completely different accounts. Yesterday, I thought that the most important piece of evidence was the fact that it looked to me unlikely that a Hamas rocket could cause the amount of damage that had been alleged as a result of this attack. Today, there is some reason to doubt that the amount of damage is as great as people say. I'm not saying it wasn't, by the way. It's just that there is discrepancies about this. I'm not in a position, as I said, to give judgment. We have completely different accounts, minus an independent investigation. It is impossible, for me at least, to arrive to any definite conclusions. And I'm afraid I think that is all that I can say. Now, there are a few further points which I will add. There's one piece of evidence which I, frankly, am going to completely disregard, and that is radio intercept evidence. The Israelis have produced a radio, what appears to be a recording of two Hamas officials apparently discussing a strike by a Hamas or Islamic Jihad missile on a hospital. I'm sorry to say this, but I've had much experience in the Middle East, and by the way in Ukraine, of people producing what they call radio intercept evidence of this kind. I invariably consider this evidence to be all but worthless. it's actually extremely easy to fake such evidence. I'm not saying this evidence has been faked, but it's actually extremely easy to do so. I know of occasions when it has been done, and frankly, again, without an independent investigator able to carry out proper checks of this recording, I'm not frankly going to place any reliance upon it at all. I mean, it's some evidence that the Israelis have produced. It might be good evidence, it might be bad evidence. I can't say, so I'm going to ignore it. The second is that there was a long article by Alistair Heath in the Telegraph, who has written at furious length about the incredible bias on the part of the media in immediately accepting the Hamas account of what had happened when there was good reason to doubt it. And he says that he himself doesn't know, and he's prepared to preserve an open mind, but it is absolutely wrong and astonishing and very bad that the media should have rushed to conclusions. And, you know, I'm not going to disagree with any of that, except I will say this: Alistair Heath has been around for a very, very long time, and I never remember him saying the same thing about any similar atrocities which have been attributed to the Russians. On no occasion, when there have been alleged hospital bombings in Syria, attacks on buildings or destructions of buildings in Ukraine, or anything of that kind, has he written an article, any kind of article, in the Telegraph expressing anger at the media bias and the rush to attribute things to the Russians without independent investigation. I just say that because what is sauce for the goose, as we say in Britain, should be sauce for the gander, but when it comes to the Russians, it never is. And the third point I'm going to make, which is the most important one, and is the point which I made in my programme yesterday, is that it makes absolutely no difference at all who actually did attack this hospital and what happened there. By now, the opinion, the view that it was Israel that attacked this hospital and killed hundreds of people has been spread and has been internalized across the Arab and Muslim worlds. And there is nothing that is going to happen which is going to make people in the Arab and Muslim world change their opinions about it. Whether one likes that fact or not, that is now the political fact. It is a political fact. The only way to have prevented that happening would have been to do what I suggested earlier in the programme: call immediately an emergency meeting of the Security Council in New York, agree on an independent and impartial investigation, authorise the investigators, have a Security Council resolution passed which would have empowered the investigators and instructed all the belligerent parties to cooperate with the investigators, in which case it might have been possible to persuade people across the Arab world and the Middle East and the Islamic world to wait until the investigation had reached its conclusions and provided its reports, and then carry out a proper, independent and transparent investigation. And that, had it been done quickly, had it been done immediately, as it should have been, might have prevented opinions from being formed. Of course, that didn't happen. I don't get the sense that any of the participants in this conflict, it even crossed their mind. I would finally finish by saying that President Putin of Russia was asked about this incident in a press conference he's just given in Beijing, and it was extremely interesting to see what he had to say about it. He was remarkably careful in his use of words, and we have obviously a transcript which the Kremlin has provided, in which he says this: with regard to the strike on the hospital, the tragedy that happened there, this is a horrible event which killed hundreds and left hundreds more wounded. Of course, this is a disaster for such a thing to happen in this place, especially considering its humanitarian mission. I do hope that this will serve as a signal that this conflict must end as quickly as possible. In any case, there must be a push paving the way towards the launch of contacts and talks. He's very careful, in other words, not to assign blame on either party. And he clearly doesn't know, and nor do we, at least nor do I. That's the position I'm finally going to take on this matter. Now, I mentioned growing pressure on the United States. I mentioned the United Nations, and almost entirely ignored, we had the second draft resolution calling for a ceasefire proposed to the Security Council yesterday. Now, the first resolution, as I discussed, was proposed by the Russians. It was voted down, or rather it didn't get the necessary number of votes. The Western powers voted against it, and several countries, including Brazil, abstained. The Russians then published an excoriating statement criticizing the Western powers for sabotaging progress on the resolution, and saying that people are dying in their hundreds and in their thousands in the Middle East, and the Security Council is left inactive because of what the United States and its allies are doing in the Security Council. The blame for the failure of the resolution to pass was laid squarely, in other words, by the Russians on the United States. And I said that more resolutions were coming. I've discussed how this is a chess game in the Security Council, that the Western powers are being maneuvered onto the defensive, and somewhat to my surprise, as soon as that Russian resolution failed, another resolution immediately came. One followed upon the other immediately. And it was very interesting that this resolution this time, which is not fundamentally different from the resolution that the Russians proposed, that this resolution was on this occasion drafted and sponsored by Brazil. Now, Russia and Brazil are both BRICS states. I registered some surprise that Brazil abstained on the Russian draft. I think it is now clear that this was an agreed move in advance, that the Russians and Brazilians agreed that together. The Russians knew that the Western powers would vote against the Russian draft, but by having Brazil abstain, that was intended to give the impression that Brazil was preserving an open mind. Anyway, the Brazilians, on that basis, having positioned themselves as a supposedly impartial party, went ahead and proposed their resolution. And I should say that it's clear to me that this resolution, this next draft of a resolution, must have been worked on by the Brazilians and probably the other BRIC states. I'm sure that there was an agreement already that the Russians would start the game, they'd open the chess game by proposing their resolution, and when that failed, the Brazilians would propose theirs, and I suspect that these two draft resolutions, were prepared at the same time with all the BRICS countries, or at least the Russians and the Brazilians and probably the Chinese, working on these resolutions together. Anyway, this Brazilian resolution got 12 votes. The Western powers, the United States, Britain and France, voted against it. That means that the resolution was vetoed, and of course it failed. We can see how the pressure in the Security Council is gradually growing. These need to be understood as first moves. The Americans and their allies have been isolated in the Security Council. The Russians, by the way, and the Chinese voted for, they supported the Brazilian resolution. There will now, I suspect, be an interval. We will have the fighting in Gaza. There will be more reports of more civilians killed and injured over time. Calls for a ceasefire will grow. As night follows day, another resolution will come, perhaps sponsored by the Arab states, perhaps sponsored by the BRIC states. Eventually, if the United States and the Western countries continue to veto this resolution in the Security Council, the sponsors, the BRIC states, the Arab states, the Global South, will take it to the General Assembly, and there it will win a majority. Now, resolutions passed by the General Assembly are not legally binding in the way that Security Council resolutions are, unless they come under the format of the Uniting for Peace formula, which was last used, by the way back in 1979, and whose legality, incidentally, is not universally accepted anyway. So, such a resolution would not carry legal force, but it would expose the extent to which the United States and its allies are becoming isolated in this, within international opinion. And as I discussed yesterday, as the Financial Times has discussed, there are now growing worries amongst Western diplomats that the next time the West proposes some kind of Ukraine-related resolution to the General Assembly, it will fail, causing massive political embarrassment and humiliation for the West and for the United States. So the pressure is growing, and though it is unlikely, in my opinion, that the United States is going to change course, there are domestic political pressures in the United States which are likely to keep the Americans on this current path. It's likely that in Europe, support will eventually fracture. Already President Macron of France is doing what he loves to do, signalling his dissent without taking any actual steps, but eventually this will grow, and the United States will eventually be faced with a situation, assuming this crisis is prolonged, when it could find that it is not only losing support from the global south and from the BRICS states in the General Assembly, but it is also starting to lose the support of its own core allies within the some of its own core allies within the collective West. Now, I say that it's possible that 3 countries within the collective West will remain on side: Britain, Germany, and so long as Prime Minister Meloni remains in office, Italy as well. But Germany, whose hapless Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is also on a tour of the Middle East. He also is coming in for an incredibly rough ride. He was apparently also lectured by King Abdul of Jordan when he visited Amman, but he has apparently been taken also publicly to task by the President of Egypt, President al-Sisi. Now, I haven't seen the video of this, but apparently there is a video circulating, and apparently it's even tougher. Al-Sisi was even tougher and more robust with the Germans than he was with the Americans. So even on the Europeans, the pressure now is on. Now, this is the situation that we're in at the moment. There is plenty of possibility for this conflict to escalate. And by the way, Putin gave what he said was a rather interesting warning in terms of Russian military deployments in the Black Sea, and he appeared to link them with American military deployments in the Eastern Mediterranean. And he was asked about the delivery of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, and he spoke about the fact that this was a huge mistake by the United States. But then he had this to say, and this was at the same press conference in Beijing. They, which is to say the United States, have upped and dragged 2 carrier task forces to the Mediterranean. I want to say what I'm going to say and inform you about is not a threat, that I have instructed the Russian aerospace forces to start patrolling the neutral zone over the Black Sea on a permanent basis. Our MiG-31 aircraft carry the Kinjal systems that, as is common knowledge, have a range of over 1,000 kilometers and can reach speeds of up to Mach 9. And that was a somewhat mystifying comment. But then, of course, he had more to say. A journalist, Pavel Zarubin, asked me, what you said about patrolling over the Black Sea, would that not be called another threat from Russia? And Putin emphasized, I emphasized that it is not a threat, but we will perform visual control and weapons-based control over what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Putin goes out of his way to say this is not a threat, but it is a warning. If there is a regional war, if those carrier task groups go into action against Iran or Hezbollah, then what Putin is telling the Americans is, look, we see where you are. We know about the dangers of what you're trying to do. We have fighter jets, MiG-31s, patrolling over the Black Sea. They're equipped potentially with Kinjal missiles. They can reach your carrier groups. That essentially is what he's saying. He says this is a warning not a threat, but then sometimes the line between a warning and a threat is, so we say, fungible. And on this occasion, I wonder what kind of a warning it is. And it does look to me like a very strong warning indeed not to escalate the war by, say, attacking Iran. Anyway, there we are. So, a dangerous situation overall. It does, unfortunately, look as if a ground operation in Gaza is going to happen. We can see that the Russians are giving warnings about what that might mean. And though I have to say, a Russian hypersonic missile strike against an aircraft carrier, an American aircraft carrier, seems to me such an astonishing and dangerous escalation that I don't even want to consider the consequences. And I can't frankly believe that Putin is genuinely contemplating it. But anyway, I suppose the intention is to complicate a little any American military planning. But the biggest story is that even as this ground operation in Gaza is apparently about to start, we can see that at the UN, the diplomatic pressure is on. I know lots of people tend to pay no attention to what the United Nations does, but I think that this is mistaken. Always, when you see these conflicts in the Middle East, the fighting normally stops in conjunction with a UN Security Council resolution. I remember that happened, for example, in 1973 during the Arab-Israeli war of that year. And of course, there were Security Council resolutions. There was a Security Council resolution, which, as I remember, also took place in 2006 during the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. So these events in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, do matter. And as we saw from that article in the Financial Times yesterday, Western diplomats are worried about them, even if they don't seem to be able so far to get through to the United States, to the President himself, and to perhaps his most senior advisors, who, in the way that they always do, see the situation in the Middle East as a challenge which, for the moment, requires escalation more than diplomacy, with the President doing his usual thing of talking diplomacy, but actually doing escalation. Now that brings me back to the topic of Ukraine, because as I discussed yesterday, we now have confirmation that ATACMS missiles have been supplied to Ukraine and a first missile strike on the Russian base at Berdyansk. And we've also seen satellite photos of the airbase at Berdyansk. And I have to say that these do not show the dramatic results that I, for one, had expected. I'm not somebody who can look at these photos and reach conclusions from them. I'm not in a position to assess or examine photos in that kind of way. But those who are able to do these things, they see scorch marks on the runways. Some, they assume, are caused by damage to helicopters, but it's been suggested that the primary damage was done to ammunition, one particular ammunition dump, and to fires, fire damage caused by fuel dumps, also burning. And it's been suggested that human casualties were minor. that no pilots were killed. Some ground staff might have been killed, but it's more likely that it was more a case of ground staff being injured. And there is great debate about the number of helicopters which were actually destroyed. It's apparently difficult to reach a proper conclusion about this from the photographs. Everyone accepts that at least 2 helicopters were damaged and probably destroyed, but there is some debate about whether a total of 9 helicopters was actually destroyed, as has been claimed by Ukraine. It's been suggested, in fact, that the damage caused by this strike might not have been as extensive as was first suggested. I repeat what I said in my program yesterday. However much damage was caused, this looks to me like an expensive use of expensive weapons which are in relatively short supply to attack a target, Russian helicopters, which the Russians will have no difficulty in replacing. So I would have thought that this was a bad trade. Now, there's been further discussion about this missile strike. It's now suggested by various sources that the total number of helicopters, of missiles, ATACMS missiles supplied to Ukraine is not 60 or 20, but only 12. It's been suggested also that the total number of missiles launched was just 3 rather than 6. If it was 6, then half the stockpile of missiles has already been used in this one attack. If it was 3, then that's a quarter. If the stockpile really is only 12. These are uncertain figures. None of us can say exactly what the true number is. Both the true number of missiles used, the true number of missiles shot down, and the true number of missiles supplied. We don't have those numbers. But anyway, it was, so it seems to me, an expensive misuse of missiles that are in short supply, however many have in fact been delivered, even if it's, let's say, 60, which is the top number being suggested. 3 out of 60 would be a significant use of missiles on one strike, which apparently didn't do quite as much damage as initially assumed. But anyway, the point is that it's now been suggested that these are not particularly modern or useful missiles for Ukraine. They have cluster warheads, which apparently cannot do significant damage to hardened structures. And that, by the way, suggests that the Russians now have an option, one possible option, which is to build concrete shelters or hangars for their helicopters. It's perhaps surprising that they haven't done so before, but they've shown with the fortifications that they constructed, the Surovikin line, how quickly they can build heavy reinforced concrete structures if they need to, and I suspect they could do so quite quickly. At Berdyansk, if they decide that that is what they need to do, and we might start to see them. But anyway, that's one possibility. But secondly, these missiles apparently are old. They're perhaps not in the best condition. And they do not use GPS guidance. They use autonomous guidance, they're launched, and they use, inertial guidance or whatever it is, which means that they are fairly accurate. They're not anywhere close to being as accurate as the later versions of the ATACMS. And besides, if they're launched from at the edge of their range, which is only 165 kilometers, not 300 kilometers, then even in the best conditions, errors apparently are likely to increase over the course of their flight, diminishing their effectiveness. And it seems to me that this is a sign that the United States remains still very half-hearted about supplying these ATACMS missiles. There's already been complaints, criticism from some of Ukraine's supporters, people like Mr. Repke of Bild Zeitung and David Axe of Forbes, that less effective missiles have in fact been supplied, and that these are not the ones that are the real game changers and the ones that Ukraine actually needs. But beyond that, Mr. Repke has suggested that supplying the better, more accurate missiles might not actually work, because the Russians have been successful in jamming GPS signals. And curiously enough, the more modern ATACMS missiles are more vulnerable, therefore, to Russian missile interceptions. Well, that may all be true. As I said, I'm not an expert in these matters. I simply don't know. But I'm perfectly willing to accept and believe it. Anyway, that's the ATACMS. There's been various suggestions that these ATACMS were launched in conjunction with what some people are saying was Ukraine's first serious attempt to launch a cross-border operation, river operation in the Dnieper. There were lots of reports over the last couple of days that Ukraine has managed to infiltrate some of its troops, several hundred of its troops, onto the east bank, that they occupied a village and approached a small town in this area. And some people are seeing all of this as being part of this great amphibious operation across the Dnieper that we've been hearing so much about over the last few days. Now, there is enormous amount of confusion as to what exactly has happened in terms of this particular operation. It's clear that the Ukrainians did land some troops onto the east bank of the Dnieper and that they did advance some distance, though I would point out that this would hardly be the first time this has happened. The most reliable reports that I have seen, and that's not saying very much because there is heavy fog of war about this, suggest that the Russians rapidly drove these Ukrainian troops back, and that they've either been pinned against the Dnieper or have crossed onto the neighbouring islands. I don't know exactly what the facts are, but it all looks for the moment very underpowered, with numbers of troops deployed by the Ukrainians numbering no more than perhaps 100 or 200. It doesn't look like the start of some big amphibious operation to me. Perhaps more like a reconnaissance in force, trying to assess how strong Russian defences are in this area than anything else. But anyway, this is an intriguing affair. Putin in Beijing did seem to think that this was the start of this operation across the river. He said that the Ukrainians are doing it after the failure of their offensive in Zaporozhye region. And that, of course, of that there is no doubt. But I have to say that Ryba, who is perhaps the person who has provided the greatest amount of information about this incident, he says that essentially this was more about public relations than anything else, and that the entire operation made no military sense. Well, I'm not sure exactly what is going on. I doubt that it will make any real difference, and I'm not going to discuss it until I know a little more and until we have a clearer idea of what exactly is happening. Anyway, Putin was asked about the supply of the ATACMS missiles. He said that this was a mistake. It's not going to make any difference to the conduct of the war. And he said this. He said, and finally, Ukraine gains nothing. This simply prolongs its agony. They have started yet another announced and expected counteroffensive in the Kherson sector without any effects so far, which would appear to confirm that the Ukrainians have been driven back. Losses there are, but no result like previously in Zaporozhye and other sectors. Therefore, this is also a mistake from this point of view. So I said yesterday that I'd heard that Putin had spoken about Ukraine's destruction. He's now talking, it's clear that he was talking instead about prolonging Ukraine's agony, but he doesn't seem to be particularly concerned about the ATACMS. He said that we can fend off these attacks and the ATACMS. Make no mistake about that. War is war. They pose a threat. This is obvious. What matters most is that this cannot bring about any radical changes along the line of contact. It is impossible. This we can say for sure. So the Russians are not intimidated or concerned about this deployment. Lastly, I will finish this discussion of the ATACMS by saying that it's also been pointed out to me that as well as being able to shoot down ATACMS missiles and monitor their launch, the MiG-31s, if they are also carrying Kinzhals, could very, very rapidly attack the launch points of the ATACMS missiles. Hypersonic missiles move at Mach 9. Apparently, the launching equipment for the ATACMS are these tracked M270 vehicles. They're apparently slower to move than the wheeled vehicles used by the HIMARS system, and it might be that the Kinzhals are intended to attack the Ukrainians at the launch point as soon as these ATACMS missiles are launched. Anyway, there's been a lot more information about the fighting in Avdiivka. I'm not going to go into it in further detail, but the overall story is that the Russians are indeed advancing in Avdiivka despite claims about massive losses. The kind of people on the Russian side who are normally most critical of actions by the Russian Defense Ministry, and who, in my experience, never hesitate to talk about heavy losses experienced by the Russians when they have happened, on this occasion are, on the contrary, debunking claims that the Russians have suffered especially heavy losses in the fighting in Avdiivka. On the contrary, they all seem to be saying that the Russians are indeed closing the vice around Avdiivka, and they're attacking in other places as well, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. to some extent near Bakhmut and further north around Kupiansk. But it's clear that the heaviest fighting at the moment is around Avdiivka, and apparently there's been more Russian advances, especially the southern pincer has made further progress. But every Russian report which I have seen acknowledges that this is going to take weeks, given how heavily fortified Avdiivka is, and given the very large concentration of Ukrainian troops who are located there. The Russians are saying that this is going to be as complex and as prolonged an operation as the capture of Bakhmut, and that is how we need to understand it. Well, that is the point where I'm going to finish this program. Now, as of today, as I understand it, the summit meeting, the BRI summit meeting in Beijing is ending. I'm still in the process of processing all of the vast amount of information that's coming out of it. I still intend to discuss this in this channel, but I expect that Alex Christoforou and I will be doing a dedicated program on this topic, which will appear on the Duran. And as I said, this is where I finish for today, and there'll be more from me soon. To remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.